Story: The Mysterious Painting. In a small town, the story of an enigmatic painting began to unfold. Mr. Trinh approached a tomb, his weathered hands clearing away some tall weeds to reveal the tombstone within. Once the weeds were cleared, he sat down beside the tomb, pointing at the tombstone and said, "The person buried here met a truly unfortunate end, a death that required a sacrifice. If the owner of this tomb hadn't died, many others might have perished alongside him." Listening intently, Liu turned to Mr. Trinh and asked, "What was the owner of this tomb like?" Mr. Trinh looked up at the sky for a moment, pondering deeply before replying, "I don't remember clearly. It's been a long time since he passed away. As for his occupation when he was alive, I'm not sure, but I believe he was a good person, a true hero in his own right." Liu sat quietly, eagerly awaiting the unfolding story of this mysterious individual. Mr. Trinh continued, "Before he died, he left me a letter of final instructions. He asked to be buried with something, to end the nightmare once and for all." Liu inquired, "Did he meet you before he died?" Mr. Trinh nodded. "Not only did he meet me, but he died in front of me." Liu's eyes widened, shocked to learn that the person beneath the tomb had taken their own life before Mr. Trin's eyes. What could have led someone to such a desperate act? As Mr. Trinh began to recall the old tale, Liu listened intently. It was a story recorded in the deceased's final letter, a story about a painting. Hardwung Kam was a renowned artist, celebrated in artistic circles for his abstract paintings, often deeply intricate and open to interpretation. Though his life was brief, he left behind a profound artistic legacy. Just as he completed what was considered his masterpiece, he met his untimely demise. He died with a look of astonishment on his face, collapsing before his own painting, his fingers seemingly clawing at his eyes. The news of Hardwung Kam's death sent shockwaves through the art world. His final painting was deemed the most valuable artwork of all time and was immediately put up for auction by his family. A record-breaking bid was placed by a Vietnamese expatriate from the United States, who brought the painting back to Vietnam. Despite its successful auction, many still sought the painting out of curiosity. Some believed that within its enigmatic depths lay secrets that drove Hardwung Kam to his shocking end. However, the painting's journey took a mysterious turn. Each subsequent owner met a tragic fate similar to the artist's own demise, raising questions about the painting's true nature. As speculation grew, the government intervened, launching an investigation into the series of deaths linked to the painting. Lead investigator Hoang Xuan Dan pursued every lead, searching for any connection between the victims. Was the culprit a passionate art enthusiast, unwilling to let the painting fall into others' hands? Or was there a deeper motive behind the deaths? Dan considered various theories, ultimately suspecting that the perpetrator orchestrated the deaths to appear natural, intending to reclaim the painting through legitimate means. But just as the investigation gained traction, the painting vanished once again, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unsolved mysteries. Dan reluctantly closed the case, unable to find any concrete leads or motives behind the deaths. With no apparent connections between the victims and their solitary lifestyles, the case remained unsolved, leaving the legend of the mysterious painting to fade into obscurity, its secrets lost to time. Ellipsis. 2 years later, Dan walked steadily down the deserted street. In the cold, misty night, he suddenly noticed a figure of a woman gliding as if flying through the darkness. Her slender, delicate silhouette seemed fragile yet strangely beautiful. The woman appeared secretive, glancing around as if afraid of being noticed. This heightened Dan's attention, suggesting she might be engaging in some illicit activity, avoiding detection. His instinct suggested she might be about to commit a crime. Dan followed her closely, not letting her out of his sight. And from the moment he started trailing her, she seemed unaware of his presence. She walked casually, seemingly oblivious to someone shadowing her. Dan kept trailing her until she stopped in front of a house and quietly slipped inside. The door was left ajar, and with a bit of caution, Dan surveyed the surroundings before sneaking in. Inside, he continued down the corridor the girl had just entered. Her figure remained concealed up ahead, still within Dan's sight. But just a few more meters, her silhouette suddenly vanished, startling Dan. He tried to compose himself, knowing this corridor was a dead end. So where had the girl disappeared to? Before he could answer that question, something caught his eye, leaving him speechless. The painting. Yes, it was the very painting that had stirred up controversy for years. It was the mysterious missing painting by Hoang Duong Cam. Dan was surprised to find it here. Why was it here, and why in this woman's house? Where had the woman disappeared to? Without waiting for answers, following his detective instincts, once a lead was discovered, to ensure safety and avoid entanglement, Dan withdrew, leaving the corridor and the house. After exiting, Dan meticulously memorized the house's appearance, including its address, architecture, and surrounding landscape, noting every detail. Back at the police station, Dan decided not to disclose this incident to anyone and investigate it himself. He planned to approach the girl and find out how she obtained the painting. Could she be the murderer of the 3 previous owners, killing to acquire the painting? With his plan in place, the next day, Dan relied on his memory to return to the scene. It was the same house, a luxurious classic French villa. It was located in a quiet neighborhood near a cemetery, with no other houses around. The house seemed long unattended, with fallen leaves covering the lawn. The paint on the walls had peeled off due to the passage of time. The daytime scene of the house was vastly different from the night before, as if a light switch had been turned on or off. Last night, it had an eerie, mysterious aura, but today, it looked beautiful and radiant. Approaching the house, Dan gently knocked on the wooden door 3 times. Then, he stood silently, waiting. But there was no response, no sound coming from behind the door. It remained silent. After waiting a while longer with no movement, Dan prepared to knock again. This time, the door opened, but there was no one in sight. Only a voice echoed out. "What do you want? Who are you looking for?" Dan was slightly taken aback, not knowing whom he was talking to. But last night, before he arrived, he had come up with enough reasons and excuses to approach the woman. He had many arguments to persuade her and plenty of credentials to impress her. He adjusted his appearance a bit and replied confidently, "Hello, I'm a great enthusiast of antique houses, and the architecture of this house is beautiful. I'd like to buy it. Would you?" But before Dan could finish, a voice from inside swiftly and decisively interrupted. "Not for sale." Dan was slightly surprised by how quickly she refused, considering he hadn't even finished speaking yet. But he remained confident he could break down her defenses. He didn't discuss his intentions for approaching her yet. But focusing solely on his appearance and skills, he recounted how many beautiful female police officers had fallen for him back in the police academy. There were even times when he was courted on campus. He had encountered many such incidents. Later, when he started working, there were many other beautiful girls who pursued him, but he never approved of any of them. Dan considered himself noble, and to choose someone to develop feelings for, they had to be better than others. Although he hadn't seen this girl's face, only heard her voice, he guessed her figure was not too bad. And if she was slightly unattractive, it would be even easier to approach her. Before coming here, Dan carefully planned 2 scenarios. 1. If she agreed to sell the house, Dan would use that as a legitimate reason to inquire about any movements, including the painting's background. 2. If she didn't agree, Dan would immediately switch to Plan B, which was to ask for a tour of the house and court her. Both approaches were designed to access the woman for investigation, a tactic commonly known as male strategy. After weighing everything in his mind, Dan continued to speak earnestly. "All right. If you're not interested in that, could you please let me tour the house a bit? I'm very fond of antique architecture, and I'd like to recreate some of those architectural styles elsewhere." After speaking, Dan stood still, waiting. A long time passed before there was a response. "Okay, you can come in." The girl agreed to let Dan in, though her tone didn't seem cheerful. Dan was excited, nodded politely, and stepped in with the grace of a gentleman. Inside, he noticed the lights were already on. A very beautiful girl with a high nose, big sparkling eyes, and very seductive lips was holding a glass of wine, looking provocatively at him. Dan inclined his head in greeting. Then, without waiting for her invitation to sit down, he approached, saying, "I didn't expect the owner of this house to be such a beautiful and youthful woman." The girl also tilted her head in response, saying, "Age doesn't necessarily indicate success." Then, she gestured towards the painting hanging on the wall at the end of the hallway. It was visible behind the window frame. She continued, "Do you know the artist who painted that? He was quite young too." Dan pretended to be surprised, slowly turning his head to look at the painting as if seeing it for the first time. He murmured softly, "Oh, I've never seen such a beautiful painting in my life." The girl's expression slightly darkened, and she seemed tense as she asked Dan, "Do you understand everything the painting expresses? Can you see all the issues in it?" Dan kept staring at the painting, unaware of the clear hostility in the girl's eyes, as if she wanted to devour him alive if he couldn't answer according to her intentions. Dan inclined his head slightly, then turned back to the girl. Her face had now transformed into a smile, concealing the murderous intent from earlier, looking extremely attractive to Dan. Dan cheerfully replied, "This painting is beautiful, but it probably contains too many profound secrets. I can't see all the issues in it. The person who painted this is truly a genius." The girl smirked, her finger tracing over her seductive red lips. She said, "Yes. To understand that painting, even for an art connoisseur, it would take at least 2 years to grasp the hidden issues." Dan was extremely interested and said, "Oh, so what about someone who's not knowledgeable about art?" The girl continued to smile, with a silent, threatening air. In her eyes, determination gradually emerged. She replied, "It would also take about 2 years, with my help." After saying this, Dan felt satisfied. The key issues of the case seemed to be gradually revealing themselves. This girl was definitely related to the secrets of that painting. And above all, she could very well be the murderer. Dan looked at the girl for a moment, then said politely, "You are truly beautiful. I would like to admire you more. And I also request permission to come here many more times to admire that painting, if you allow it." The girl thought for a moment, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. Not because she was worried about the sudden proposal from a stranger, but because she was concerned about her actions towards him and whether they were too hasty. Dan waited patiently, gently reminding her several times. After repeating it for the 3rd time, she seemed to awaken from her reverie. She smiled and agreed. "All right, I agree, but for convenience, please come at night. I'm not usually at home during the day." After saying that, she winked at Dan provocatively, implying he should charge into battle. Dan nodded, politely bidding farewell to the girl. "Then, I'll take my leave. If it's all right with you, I'll come back tomorrow night. Please help me interpret the painting, and if you don't mind, allow me to invite you to dinner to reciprocate your hospitality." The girl thought for a moment, then shook her head, replying, "No need. I'm happy just having you come to see the painting. It's rare to find someone with similar interests. I don't like going out. You can just come here, and we'll have dinner together. I'll prepare everything to entertain you." Dan was delighted. "All right, goodbye." After saying goodbye, he turned and left the house. As soon as he left, the wooden door closed shut. After this first conversation with her, Dan felt like he had just experienced a sweet taste that he had never tasted before. Returning to the police station, Dan continued to collect all the documents related to how forensic examination of an artistic painting was conducted. In the conversation with the girl, he showed great interest in the painting, so in the next meeting, he still needed to prepare a bit to present himself as a professional. With this, the conversation would flow smoothly and naturally, making her not suspect anything about his investigation. The next evening, Dan appeared in front of the house again, with a beautiful bouquet of roses in his hand. When going for dinner at someone's house, it's always good to bring along a gift for the host. Dan thought this would be fitting for the girl living in this European-style vintage house. Surely, she would appreciate what Dan did. He raised his hand to the wooden door and once again knocked 3 times at regular intervals. Just like last time, it took a long time before the door opened. This time, Dan saw the girl standing right in front of him, obviously not like the last time he met her, where she seemed almost supernatural, almost scaring Dan out of his wits. She looked at Dan and smiled seductively, saying, "Please come in." Dan slightly bowed, then politely offered the bouquet with his arm straight, and his elbow slightly raised. He brought the bouquet close to her face, letting the fragrance fill the air. He said in a sweet tone, "For you, my esteemed art mentor." The girl looked very happy. She took the bouquet and quickly placed it in a vase, then carefully admired it. Both started the dinner with a very romantic atmosphere, accompanied by hot topics revolving around art. From there, Dan began to approach the girl and day by day conversed with her. He understood more deeply about the painting hanging on the wall. The subsequent curtains were gradually unveiled. But that wasn't what frightened Dan the most. What scared him the most was his diminishing calmness in front of the girl over time. And that the dashing and handsome gentleman Hoang Xuan Dan had to surrender at the sweet doorstep of the woman, to her temptations full of sweetness. He had fallen for her. Suddenly a year had passed since Dan began to come here regularly. He felt this place was very familiar, like his second home. The woman was similar, she was like a sweet and gentle wife. Whenever Dan was there, her emotions remained the same as they were at the beginning. Today, Dan stood before the door of the house again. As he raised his hand to knock, the door immediately opened on its own. It was still the same girl, still as calm as ever. With a familiar yet distant look that never changed. It was this demeanor of hers that made Dan lose himself. The handsome and dashing gentleman Hoang Xuan Dan had never been so overwhelmed by a woman like this before. The girl looked at him and said, "Please come in." Dan nodded, and as usual, there was a bouquet. Today it was a bouquet of daisies. The girl quickly accepted it and continued to put it back in the vase. While the girl wasn't paying attention, Dan continued to flip through his daily journal as a habit. Over the past year, everything he encountered, the girl's expressions, their conversations, and topics, were clearly recorded. Apart from realizing he had fallen for the girl, he also discovered in that abstract painting. It turned out to be composed of hundreds of overlapping scenes. Each scene was distinct, requiring keen eyes and deep interpretation to discern. And within each scene, it seemed to depict a story, the scenes seamlessly connected to form a cohesive narrative. Over the past year, Dan had understood about a third of the profound meaning in the painting, and he would uncover more if his artistic perception improved. The curtains behind would reveal faster. Dan stepped into the house, feeling the tranquil atmosphere and the scent from the girl. A strange, extremely pleasant scent, like the smell of oil paint from a canvas. Dan was extremely fascinated by this scent on her body, and he had often tried to inquire. However, just like every time, she only smiled without responding. A deep mystery within her. What secrets did she hide? A year for an investigation, it was quite ambitious for a skilled detective like Dan. A year had passed, and the case of 3 murders was still at a standstill. And it seemed that Dan himself had forgotten that he was supposed to investigate the case first and foremost, not to court the woman. But perhaps the extensive time spent with her had caused Dan to forget and turned his secondary goal into his primary one. Today, he even prepared sweet words, ready to confess to her. Looking at the girl carrying the plates of luxurious food, Dan slowly approached her without a sound, then gently stroked her hair as if petting a cat. The girl suddenly turned to look at Dan. The smile on her face disappeared, replaced by a puzzled furrowed brow. "What are you doing?" Dan felt a bit flustered, but he was also overwhelmed by the flames of love. He spoke emotionally. "Has anyone ever told you about the story of a student liking their teacher?" The girl tilted her head and said, "It seems not. But if they did, that student would probably be expelled for such foolishness." Dan widened his eyes in amusement, surprised by her explanation. He chuckled wryly. "So, if I told you that most of those stories end with the beautiful love of both parties, what would you think?" The girl sat down, smirked at Dan, and said, "Ultimately, they are just swept away by their own love to the point of losing reason. And usually, when one breaks the rules, there will always be some consequences." Dan understood the profound meaning in her words. Essentially, she was implying that if Dan had such thoughts about her, it would be better to extinguish them before facing the consequences. But Dan couldn't easily let go. How could a dashing man like him abandon a love affair? Especially when he had plenty of other girls pursuing him. Just because of her, he had forsaken everything. Was he supposed to accept an outcome that wasn't of his choosing? He said, "What if that student still persists despite everything? Love is sometimes more blind than the rational advice of many." The girl pondered slowly, then suddenly brought up another issue. She asked, "Do you remember the 3rd scene in the painting?" Dan nodded. "I do, but why?" The girl said, "It's also a fox sitting in front of the doorstep of a cave, the cave of the Lion King." But what if it realizes that the Lion King has feelings for it? In the fourth scene, Dan was surprised to think about this issue. He suddenly remembered that the third scene depicted a fox sitting in front of a tiger's den. But in the fourth scene, that fox had died. There was only a skeleton under the feet of a tiger. The puzzling thing was, he still couldn't understand one thing, so he asked the girl. The fox is dead, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the tiger's doing. In the fourth scene, did the tiger also shed tears before the fox's skeleton? The girl explained with a sigh. In human love, sometimes people are blind to the destiny predetermined for them. And when they defy that, irony will come to them. When the tiger realizes it also has feelings for the fox, it's the tiger's own hand that kills the fox. Because it was angry seeing the fox appear at its doorstep every day, but one day, after it had killed it, it felt a pang of nostalgia for the fox. And that's the punishment for those who don't believe in fate and sacrifice for foolish emotions. Dan fell silent. Perhaps it was best to stop the topic here. Because her answer was too clear, Dan sat back down, forced a smile at her, and said, "It seems we've come back to the first scenes in the painting, haven't we? Maybe we should explore the next scenes. The issue of the fox and tiger is something we've discussed many times over the past year." The girl smiled again. She said, "That's right, although the fox and tiger stories are just sidelines. But they are the foundation to build such a great artistic painting. Perhaps I haven't told you that to understand the whole painting, you need to understand the fox and tiger stories thoroughly. It's like a universal key." The girl tilted her head again, stood up, led Dan closer to the painting, and urged him. "Now, try to see what the next scene is in this painting. It will be very useful if you know how to apply the arguments we just had." Dan followed her instructions and immediately looked up at the painting. He was slightly amazed because now he could see clearly. In the fox's skeleton, there were a pair of eyes. Changing the perspective a bit, starting from the overall view of the eyes, he could also see a quiet tiger lying inside the belly of an elephant. The girl asked, "What do you see now?" Dan stuttered, "It's strange. Why do I see an elephant, a very giant elephant? And a little more, there's also a tiger with very long fangs." The girl replied, "That elephant is the ghost elephant, and that tiger is a saber-toothed tiger from prehistoric times. The saber-toothed tiger in this scene is similar to the fox in the third and fourth paintings." Dan nodded in understanding. It turned out that sometimes things were intertwined from many things. It's very likely that the fox was the ghost elephant transformed from a previous life, and in the next life, it was to repay its debt to the tiger. The more he thought, the more he felt this painting was too profound. Thinking back on everything from before, Dan felt there were too many deeply intertwined things in it. Not just from the painting, but also from the girl. It seemed that all his previous conversations, whether intentional or not, had become related to the painting. And it seemed that no matter how he initiated the topic, it could still turn the discussion into a key to unlock the next scene. Could it be true, as she said, that this was truly fate? Another year passed. Dan still had deep feelings for her. He had completely changed, from a cold-hearted person uninterested in any beautiful girl. Now, he was infatuated with her and gradually becoming a weak, lovesick man. What could be more miserable than seeing the person you like every day, but not being able to confess? And what about her? She was no different from the first days Dan met her, still a mysterious, irresistibly seductive girl. And 2 years had passed, that mystery had never diminished. Truly, she was a person with a terrifyingly deep soul. Dan neatly closed his diary, having recorded everything he had encountered over the past 2 years, and left it temporarily on the table. He was fully prepared to continue his journey to that ancient villa. Today was a more solemn day than any other, because today would unveil the final curtain, the last scene in the painting. It was the moment when everything would be revealed, including the deaths of the 3 individuals before him. The deaths caused by unimaginable horror, but that was not what Dan cared about the most. What he cared about the most was today, the day he would confess his feelings to her. Regardless of where her suspicions might lead. But he couldn't resist anymore. Today was his last chance, as once tomorrow came and the painting was fully interpreted, he would have no reason left to meet her again. Placing the diary on the table, along with a letter jotting down a few lines, Dan contemplated whether he should leave a last clue for the next person, in case they were unfortunate enough to read it, to perhaps find the answer. Approaching the door of the villa, the wooden door opened again. This time Dan presented a bouquet of roses just like on the first day, but this time, it consisted of 99 flowers. The girl accepted the bouquet from Dan's hand, looked at it, and furrowed her brows. She said, "If something goes against fate, I cannot guarantee your safety." Dan tilted his head and said, "Safety? I don't have those anymore. Standing before the exquisite gaze of yours, my fragile shield has completely collapsed. Love me." Dan spoke each word cautiously, with great intensity. The girl blushed, lowered her head, and remained silent. Dan gently lifted her chin and planted a sweet kiss on her lips. Then he said, "If a student falls for their teacher, can the teacher resist?" Blushing, the girl shook her head and said, "No, they cannot." Dan, intrigued, asked again, "So, should the teacher reciprocate those feelings?" The girl fell silent, her eyes sparkling like a bright autumn day. The two stood there, gazing at each other for a long while. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally sighed and uttered 3 words. "Come inside then." Then she turned away, taking the bouquet and placing it in the familiar vase. Her expression was indescribable, a whirlwind of emotions surged within her. She silently shed tears unbeknownst to Dan. Another minute passed. Dan quietly approached the painting. This time, without waiting for the girl's prompt, he immediately applied all the details from this fateful encounter to interpret the painting. He gazed slowly at the final painting, the 100th scene in the artwork. A new figure had emerged in this painting, not an animal as usual, but a person. More precisely, it was a painter, painting other scenes within the grand landscape of this large painting. Layers upon layers of oil paint piled up, creating an incredibly grand and ethereal scene. Dan noticed a detail, that the face of this painter, as he put the final strokes, displayed an expression of profound awe and amazement. Dan looked deeply into the painting that the man was painting, only to see him collapse in front of another painting, one that he himself had painted. Everything was so intricately woven together, perplexing yet fascinating. But then Dan recalled all the events in the painting, and his expression mirrored the painter's astonishment. He realized that the painter was none other than Hardwung Kam. He was the one who painted this magnificent artwork. In Dan's eyes, at that moment in the 100th scene, Hardwung Kam seemed to be genuinely alive, wailing in utter desperation. And from the 100th scene onward, everything became vividly alive. Every death, every victim, wailed in horror, like a nested film within a film, extending endlessly from within the painting that Hardwung Kam painted. Another detail emerged, that in each painting, when the person was about to die, there was always a woman standing beside them. Sweat began to drench Dan's clothes as he looked at the 104th scene, where another man stood in horror before the painting. And that man seemed to be standing right where Dan was, wailing in terror before dying. Beside him stood a girl. Finally, when he could recognize who the girl always appearing in the paintings was, he noticed the 105th painting. And the person standing in it was none other than himself, Hoang Sun Dan. As he discovered this horrifying truth, he felt a hand placed on his shoulder. It was from the girl he loved to the point of madness, and it was also from the girl who always appeared in the painting. As she placed her hand on Dan's shoulder, blood gushed from his eyes. He had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage from sheer horror. Dan's body lay cold, his eyes wide open in disbelief. Like the ones before him, he too died in a manner similar to them. All 4 deaths, including his, were identical. In that painting, there was also a 4th man who died. But why was he not known? Perhaps he was the 4th owner of this painting. After Dan's death, his body was quickly discovered thanks to the diary left on his table. His inexplicable death before the painting, just like the 4 years before, raised many suspicions. Another man's body was found right next to Dan's. But the difference was that his body had turned into bones. This indicated that 2 years prior, he had also died in a similar manner to Dan. He might have been the master thief who stole the painting during the auction. And the fact that the number of deaths before this painting never deviated, occurring every 2 years, hinted at its ominous nature. A new investigator was assigned to probe the mystery of this painting. His name was Dao Van Duke, also a distinguished detective in the field. Duke was Dan's subordinate, and it was he who discovered the secret diary recording the time Dan spent conversing with the woman. It revealed partly why Dan had to die. Was it because he confessed to the woman? No. Duke believed it was because Dan had deciphered the horrifying secret within the painting, and he had to die just like his predecessors. Duke hesitated, but the answer to that horrifying mystery only fueled his determination even more. Since Dan's death, the painting had been sealed and hidden away in an undisclosed location. Only Duke, the one in charge of this, could access the painting and uncover the hidden secrets within. The painting was hidden deep in a secret chamber of the city police station. And only Duke was the one with the key to explore it. Prior to this, Duke had spent quite some time studying about art paintings. When Dan passed away and Duke took over the case, 20 horrifying scenes out of over 100 scenes depicted in this painting could easily be recognized by him. In Duke's life, this was indeed the first time he could see such a magnificent painting. A colossal, abstract painting so profound and beautiful to perfection. Upon seeing the painting for the first time, Duke was ecstatic to the point of losing sleep. But then he also realized a truth, that the girl mentioned in Dan's diary actually appeared. On the first night when he was working with the painting, she also appeared behind him in the guise of a policewoman, which made him unsuspecting. But then he found out that no female police officer had been dispatched to collaborate with him. It could only be explained that the woman had transformed herself. Yes, she was the woman who caused Dan's inexplicable death. And she was unaware that before Dan died, he had left a diary for Duke, and in that very diary, Dan had accused everything, and her demeanor matched perfectly. Duke guessed everything and still pretended not to understand what was happening. He continued to pretend that he truly believed she was the one sent down to cooperate in the investigation. Duke didn't reveal any hint. That girl seemed quite ordinary at first glance. But Duke was different from Dan. He wasn't blinded by love to lose his rationality. It must have been because Dan loved her too much that he couldn't realize that this woman had something sinister. Not as flexible as a normal person. One day Duke flipped back to the first page of the diary, and discovered in the first conversation between Dan and her, there was a very important detail mentioned. And this detail was not mentioned again throughout the subsequent journey. That detail mentioned that the woman only wanted to meet Dan at night. So what about during the day? Duke asked himself that question. Until now he still pretended to be clueless and was an art-blind person in front of her. He said he could only see a few drawings under her guidance. But in reality, Duke had seen up to the 99th scene. Just one more paragraph. If Duke tried, he could fully see what the 100th scene in this painting would depict. But Duke didn't do that. He was completely cautious with all his actions. If this girl couldn't appear during the day, so he just needed to quietly wait until the daytime and carefully examine it outdoors to understand everything. Certainly with his speculation, so the next day Duke acted according to his calculated plan. And this time his plan was very accurate. She didn't appear in the daytime. Just like in that painting, the 100th scene was also quickly recognized by Duke. When he discovered everything, he was also amazed. Fortunately for him, he chose the right time to examine it. Otherwise, he might have faced a similar fate as those before him. After seeing the last scene, Duke also discovered that he was the one standing in it. It's just that now he didn't roll over and die. Looking at it again, Duke could vaguely see a line of text as a warning to him. If you see and don't die like us, please turn the painting over and see what's behind it. Indeed, the line of text expressed such a meaning. Duke didn't hesitate anymore and immediately did as he was told. He flipped the painting back and removed it from the frame. Another black line of text appeared. This line of text was left by the painter himself, the handwriting of Hardwung Cam. That line of text read, "Is a demon painting. If I die, please meet Master Thich Thiet Tam." With that line of text ending, it raised a question for Duke. What is a demon painting? And who is Thich Thiet Tam to know this? And where to find that person? First, Duke temporarily put that thought aside, and immediately returned to the office. He searched for the name of Master Thich Thiet Tam. Fortunately for him, he was very famous in the Buddhist monk community and could be easily found. Master Thich Thiet Tam was located at the Lian Phar Pagoda, also very easy to find within the inner city. On this very day, Duke immediately planned to visit him. When he arrived, he saw the venerable monk sweeping the pagoda. He even brought this painting to show him. At first, when he met Duke, the master pretended not to recognize him and refused to meet him. But as soon as Duke showed him the painting, he was immediately astonished. Then he pulled Duke into the temple and asked him carefully, "Where did you find this painting?" Duke said, "It's a long story, I just need to know one thing. What is the relationship between master and the painter Hardwon Cam?" The master shook his head and sighed. "What relationship? If there is a relationship, then it is our karmic connection. Back then, he went abroad to study painting, and during a visit to the temple, he really liked the way I conveyed into ancient paintings and immediately worshipped me as his teacher." Duke asked again, "So the words he said in here, did he mention a demon painting?" "What is a demon painting?" The master's face turned pale and he replied, "It's a demon formed by ancient drawings, those forbidden strokes. It did not heed my advice and always fantasized. Legend has it that the gods of the Tran dynasty could paint a painting leading to the divine realm. Those who followed those strokes all ended up drawing demons. And they all had inexplicable deaths." The master paused for a moment, then asked again, "You haven't seen the last detail yet, have you?" Duke said, "I have seen all of it. About how the demon kills." The master's pale face said, "Then I can't save you anymore. Those who see the last paintings, half of their souls are drawn into the painting. So burning the painting is also synonymous with killing you. Because no one can live with only half a soul." After saying that, the master chased Duke away. Duke didn't listen, nor did he think it was true. He brought the painting back to his hometown that very night, looking for someone reputed in the region for spiritual art purification. Although he had never believed in superstitions because he was a police officer himself. But this time the matter was too mystical, involuntarily he had to resort to folk methods to explain it. Duke found several people in this profession, but most of them didn't know. Only the last person he met. It was a very understanding person but also advised him similarly to that venerable monk, saying he had to take care of his affairs properly, and his time was running out. Duke still didn't believe this, but still wanted to try how to set himself up once. He wrote a farewell letter to prevent any unforeseen circumstances from happening. Then he went to find Mr. Trinh, asking him to keep it and instructed if anything unexpected happened to him that night, then immediately follow the wishes in the letter. Then he quietly sat there, sitting in the deserted cemetery, quietly waiting with a flashlight shining on the scene of the painting. The curtain gradually descended, accompanied by the constant eerie sounds of owls. The next frightening thing also came to Duke. When he just managed to turn back to look at the painting, it was also the time from within it. Successive shadow figures appeared. A beautiful girl stepped out of the painting, stunning Duke. She stepped in front of Duke, a little closer, then tilted her head back. Duke's eyes widened in horror, blood flowed from his eyes. His hands involuntarily reached for his own neck and then stabbed deeply inside. His eyes were shot out, blood flowed from Duke's mouth. His hands went to his neck to strangle himself to death. At that moment, Mr. Trinh saw him commit suicide, immediately exclaimed, "Duke, what are you doing?" Mr. Trinh was extremely frightened, rushing over, but Duke was already dead, showing no signs of life. In the painting, there was another finishing touch added. If anyone could devote to art, they could see it. The painting depicted the scene of a girl stepping out of the painting, her head turned upside down. All the facial features were also reversed. She reached out to pluck the eyes of the boy and strangled his neck. Mr. Trinh sighed and solemnly buried Duke's body in a separate location. After reading his farewell letter, the old man also somewhat understood the whole story. The end.
Hopefully the content has brought you interesting and meaningful moments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel to follow the channel's next videos. See you in the next video. Have a good day.